I truly don't understand what your father ever saw in you, Helen murmured sharply, her voice slicing through the stillness of the kitchen. You can't even manage to clean up after yourself. I froze mid-motion, my coffee cup paused halfway to my lips. I hadn't touched a single dish in the sink, hadn't even eaten breakfast yet, but I bit back the words rising in my throat. Getting into a confrontation with Helen never led anywhere good. My name is Julia. I'm 25 years old. 6 months ago, I lost my father unexpectedly. He left everything he had built throughout his life solely to me. Since then, I've been living with Helen, his wife of 10 years, because it felt like the right thing to do. My dad had adored her, and in some way, I thought staying with her might keep his memory close. As his only child, and with my mother gone since I was 12, I imagined Helen and I might find comfort in grieving together. But Helen hadn't been looking for a companion in sorrow. She seemed to crave control instead. At first, I assumed her coldness came from pain. We had both been devastated by my father's death. She had insisted I stay with her after the funeral, assuring me it's what he would have wanted. In the beginning, I believed her. However, as time crept on, the atmosphere shifted. Small criticisms about my clothes, my habits, even my reading preferences began surfacing nearly every day. Helen would smirk and say things like, "Your dad always said you spent too much time dreaming," or toss out biting remarks like, "No wonder you're still single. Who'd want someone who lives in chaos?" And it wasn't just what she said. Subtle things started happening that felt too pointed to be accidents. My favorite coffee mug vanished, then reappeared shattered in the trash. The thermostat would mysteriously drop to frigid temperatures, and Helen would claim she hadn't touched it. Despite all of it, I kept quiet. She had been my father's partner for a decade. He had loved her deeply. Surely, that meant there had to be goodness in her somewhere, didn't it? That morning, when Helen slammed a cabinet shut and mumbled something too low for me to catch, doubt crept in. As the hours passed, her irritation seemed to grow, snapping at me over the smallest issues and pacing the house with a strange restlessness. Later, I caught part of a phone conversation from behind a cracked door. Her voice was low, tense. "I told you, we'll talk when she's gone," she said harshly, then slammed the bedroom door. A tightness gripped my chest. Was she referring to me? I tried to brush the thought away, convincing myself I was just being paranoid. Still, the unease refused to leave, like a quiet whisper in the back of my mind warning that something was off. In my childhood, I had always been reserved. After losing my mom, it was just my dad and me, our small team facing life's challenges together. He worked tirelessly to give me a stable life, and I did everything I could to make him proud. I stayed focused on school, kept out of trouble, and never gave him reason to worry. I was 15 when he met Helen. She had seemed friendly and cheerful back then, always laughing at his jokes and offering me compliments. It wasn't easy watching him with someone new, but he seemed lighter around her, more alive. That happiness was enough for me. But after the wedding, things started to shift. Helen moved in, and her comments turned subtly sharp, though always masked with a smile. "Oh, Julia, you're so bright, but maybe you could try harder to socialize," she'd say. Or, "Your father tells me you're fiercely independent, but everyone needs a little refinement." I used to ignore those remarks, assuming they didn't mean much. Now, sitting in the home my father had poured his heart into, her words hit with the weight of truth. Everything this house, his business, all the assets, he left in my name. Not because he didn't care about Helen, but because he wanted me to be secure. He had faith that she would treat me fairly and with kindness. I wanted to live up to that trust, but Helen clearly didn't share his intentions. Even before I officially moved in, she had made her displeasure known. "It'll take some adjusting for both of us," she said with a strained smile. "But I know it's what your father would have wanted. Living here hasn't felt like an adjustment. It's been more like a constant evaluation I was destined to fail." Helen took charge of everything, from paying the bills to deciding what we ate and how the furniture was arranged. I tried to contribute, offered help, made suggestions, but they were brushed aside every time. "You wouldn't understand what it takes to manage a household," she'd say, always in that condescending tone. Still, I remained. I kept telling myself she was grieving, that this was her way of coping. I looked the other way during those late-night phone calls. I absorbed her snide comments and pretended not to notice the cold glances she threw when she thought I wasn't watching. But now, with my father gone, the sense of family I had left felt like it was slipping through my fingers. I tried so hard to hold on to the remnants, but Helen seemed determined to break whatever was left. That uneasy feeling I had earlier came creeping back, stronger than before. The memory of Helen's whispered call replayed in my head like a stuck record. "We'll talk when she's gone." Gone? What do you mean by gone? The thought first crept into my mind like a tiny shard of glass, barely noticeable but impossible to ignore. Helen had always been domineering and quick with a sharp remark, but lately, her demeanor had shifted into something more calculated, something that sent a chill down my spine. As I sat at the dining table, absent-mindedly moving food around my plate, that unsettling phone call I'd overheard earlier looped in my thoughts like a warning bell I couldn't silence. Helen's voice, overly chipper, cut through the silence. "You're quiet tonight," she observed, her eyes fixed on me, smile wide but hollow. It was the kind of smile that tried too hard, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm just feeling a bit worn out," I replied, summoning a faint smile to match hers. She continued to study me for a few moments, then shifted her attention back to her wine. "Well, try to get some rest," she said, lifting her glass. "You've seemed off lately." Her words struck me more than I expected. She wasn't lying. I had been feeling strange for weeks, persistent fatigue, nausea, and pounding headaches. I'd blamed stress, but now the timing felt too coincidental. All of these symptoms had started not long after I'd moved into her house. That night, a knot of dread tightened in my chest. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Helen had left on a late-night errand, which gave me the opportunity one didn't want to take, but felt compelled to. Despite how wrong it felt to pry into her private space, something deep down insisted that I needed to. I started with her desk. Everything was orderly, papers in neat piles, her handwriting perfectly aligned. Bills, receipts, a couple of handwritten letters, nothing suspicious. But then I saw her laptop sitting there, screen still on, unlocked. Curiosity overpowered my hesitation. I opened her email. The pit in my stomach grew heavier with each second. One thread caught my attention immediately. The subject line, "Next Steps." It was a conversation between Helen and someone named Paul. I clicked, my fingers trembling. Paul had written, "She's still there?" I assumed this would have been done already. Helen replied, "I told you, it takes time. You can't rush this. It has to look natural." Paul's response was blunt. "We don't have time for perfect. Just finish it." My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Who was Paul? And what were they talking about? I scrolled further, each message more disturbing than the last. They discussed finances, inheritance, and chillingly, how to get her out of the way. My stomach turned, and I gripped the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing. This wasn't paranoia. Helen was conspiring with this Paul against me. I shut the laptop and backed out of the room, my thoughts spiraling. Every odd moment, every strange comment suddenly made sense. Helen didn't merely dislike me, she was actively trying to remove me from her life. But I wasn't going anywhere. I locked myself in my room that night, determined not to be a passive victim. Lying in bed, staring at the glow from my phone screen, one thing became crystal clear: Helen had underestimated me. She might think she was pulling the strings, but this was my life. And I was ready to fight for it. Morning arrived with the clatter of dishes downstairs. Helen was already in the kitchen, humming a tuneless melody as she prepared breakfast. My stomach twisted, not from hunger, but from the heavy knowledge I now carried. I knew I couldn't act recklessly. Whatever she and Paul were planning, the wheels were already turning. One wrong move could ruin everything. I sat on the bed, scrolling through my phone, the emails burned into my memory. But suspicions wouldn't be enough. I needed hard evidence, something undeniable that the authorities couldn't ignore. At breakfast, the tension was thick. Helen placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of me, her cheerfulness still forced. "Got a full schedule today, don't you?" she asked, eyes searching mine. I nodded slightly, keeping my gaze down. I barely managed a few bites, my appetite long gone. Helen appeared content, a slight grin curling her lips as she sipped her coffee. Afterwards, I grabbed my coat and prepared to leave. I'm heading out to meet Lila for coffee, I told her. For a fraction of a second, Helen's expression changed. Her fingers tightened around her mug before she replied, of course. Say hello to her for me. Once I stepped outside, I immediately called Lila. Julia, what's going on? She asked, alarmed by the panic in my voice. I need to talk to you in person, I said, my voice shaking. It's about Helen. I think she's trying to do something. I couldn't bring myself to say the rest out loud. It felt too surreal. What do you mean? Lila pushed gently. Please, just meet me at the coffee shop, I said quickly. When I arrived, Lila was already there, seated at a corner table, her eyes filled with concern. I slid into the seat and told her everything about the emails, Helen's unnerving remarks, and the symptoms I'd been experiencing. As I spoke, Lila's expression hardened. This is serious, Julia, she said firmly. You have to go to the police. I will, I told her, managing a steadier tone than I felt. But if I show up with just suspicions and vague messages, they might dismiss it. I need solid proof. Lila nodded. Then we'll find proof, whatever it takes. Her confidence gave me a kind of strength I hadn't felt in weeks. I realized I wasn't alone in this. For the next hour, we laid out a plan. Lila proposed setting up a discreet camera in the kitchen to capture Helen's movements and suggested recording any suspicious conversations we might overhear. Although it felt like a violation of privacy, the circumstances left me no choice. Drastic situations often demanded drastic action. As I made my way back home, my nerves felt frayed, yet my determination had never been stronger. Helen might have believed she held control, but she didn't realize how wrong she was to underestimate me. The house greeted me with an unfamiliar chill when I returned. Helen sat in the living room, flipping through a magazine with forced casualness. The moment she noticed me, her eyes darted up. Her voice dripped with a sugary tone as she asked, "Did you enjoy your coffee with Lila?" I kept my response brief and calm, simply replying, yes, while moving toward my bedroom before she had the chance to probe further. My chest thudded with anxiety, but I refused to let her detect even a trace of vulnerability. Once I was behind the safety of my locked door, I retrieved the small camera Lila had handed to me earlier. Setting it up in the kitchen wouldn't be easy, but it was a step I needed to take. Helen was bound to make a mistake, and when that moment came, I had to be ready. That night, I waited in silence until I was sure she had gone to bed. The house was deathly quiet as I tiptoed downstairs, my steps muted by the rug. In the kitchen, I found an ideal hiding place for the camera, behind a row of decorative jars where it could remain unseen while capturing a full view of the room. The days that followed were steeped in tension. I forced myself to carry on as usual, keeping my demeanor steady, even as the hidden camera recorded every second in the background. Helen's behavior became increasingly unpredictable. She began lashing out over minor things, like a light being left on or a cupboard door left ajar. Her phone conversations grew more frequent too, her tone clipped and hushed. One afternoon, curiosity and dread drove me to check the footage. I locked myself in my room, plugged the device into my laptop, and started watching the videos. Initially, nothing seemed out of place, just Helen going about ordinary kitchen tasks. But on the third night, something caught my eye. There she was, standing at the counter, slowly pouring a mysterious white powder into a jar labeled sugar. She hesitated for a moment, eyes scanning the doorway as if expecting to be caught, before putting the jar back in place. A sickening feeling rose in my stomach. My suspicions had transformed into undeniable reality. Without wasting a second, I called Lila. My voice trembled as I whispered, "I have proof now." "What did you see?" she asked, tension evident in her voice. "I think she's been messing with the food." I caught her on video putting something in the sugar jar. Lila remained silent for a moment, the weight of the moment heavy through the phone. At last, she said, "Julia, you can't stay there. Not another night. Come to my place." I hesitated, my eyes flicking to the door of my room. I can't just leave. If I vanish suddenly, she'll realize I'm onto her. Then what's your plan? Lila pressed. Taking a slow, shaky breath, I answered, I need to gather everything, emails, videos, all the evidence, and then I'll go to the police. But I still need more time. Please be careful, Lila urged. Promise me you will. I promise, I replied, though unease curled in my stomach. This situation was far from over. The following morning, Helen acted oddly cheerful. She was humming a tune I had heard before as she moved around the kitchen. She even placed a plate of scrambled eggs in front of me with an overly pleasant smile. You've looked so worn out lately, she said in a sweet voice. I made this just for you. You need to stay strong. The scent of the food made me feel queasy. I glanced at the sugar jar, then at the plate in front of me. My heart pounded, but I managed to keep my face composed. Thanks, I said softly, forcing a smile and pretending to eat. I pushed the food around the plate while Helen kept a watchful eye on me. As soon as she stepped out, I grabbed a plastic bag from the pantry and carefully scraped the eggs into it. No matter what she had done, I wasn't taking any chances. I tucked the bag into my purse with the intention of having it analyzed later. That afternoon, I reviewed more of the footage. What I saw next chilled me to the bone. Helen was pacing the kitchen with her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in a sharp whisper. She's still here, Helen said, her frustration clearly mounting. I've tried everything to push her out, but she just won't go. Paul's voice responded, barely audible but distinct. Then stop wasting time. The attorney can only delay so much, and the longer she's alive, the messier this becomes. My breath hitched. The longer she's alive. That phrase echoed in my mind. It was no longer a matter of speculation, it was a clear indication of intent. I spent the rest of the day meticulously organizing every piece of evidence I had, the videos, the email exchanges, and now the tainted food. Everything pointed to a calculated effort to eliminate me. Later that evening, I called Lila once more. I have enough now, I told her, my voice unsteady. I'm going to the police first thing tomorrow. Good, she responded with firm conviction. And tonight, you're staying with me. No arguments. I agreed, quickly packing a small bag with just the essentials and all the evidence I had collected. When I told Helen I was going to Lila's for a girls' night, I put on a casual front to mask my inner panic. She didn't seem suspicious, her thoughts clearly preoccupied. But as I stepped out the door, her final words sent a chill racing down my spine. Enjoy your night, Julia, she said with a light tone, though her gaze was chilling. You never know, it might be your last. That evening at Lila's felt like the first real breath of air after being underwater for far too long. The warmth of her small apartment, scented with lavender and filled with the gentle notes of calm music, stood in sharp contrast to the cold tension of Helen's house. You're safe here, Lila reassured me while handing over a steaming mug of tea. We'll get through this together. I held the cup tightly, as though it was the only thing anchoring me to reality. I just hope the police believe me, I said quietly. What if they think I'm imagining things? They won't, she responded firmly. You've done everything by the book. The evidence you've gathered is more than enough to get them to act. The following morning, we went straight to the police station. My heart pounded with each step as I presented everything. The emails, the video footage, even the container with the scrambled eggs I had saved so carefully. I laid it all out, Helen's disturbing behavior, the physical symptoms I'd been experiencing, and the sinister scheme I had uncovered. Detective Morales, a practical and composed woman in her 40s, listened with focused intensity. Her questions were direct and incisive, but not once did she seem skeptical. After reviewing the information, she looked up. You've done a solid job here, Julia, she said seriously. This is a significant case, and we're going to handle it as such. We'll send the food for toxicology analysis and issue a warrant to search the house. If your story checks out, Helen and her partner will face the consequences. Hope flickered within me. Later that same day, Detective Morales called back. You were right, she confirmed. Tests on the food showed traces of a restricted substance. In high quantities, it could have been deadly. We're proceeding with the warrant. Stay put and keep your phone nearby. We'll update you when we know more. The relief that washed over me was powerful, but it didn't last long. That same evening, as I stayed safely at Lila's, my phone rang. Helen's voice came through, calm in a way that made my skin crawl. "I hope you're enjoying your little getaway," she said. "Just so you know, I've made a few changes around here. You don't need to come back tonight. Everything's been taken care of." A chill ran down my spine. What did she mean by taken care of? Without hesitation, I called Detective Morales and relayed what had happened. "She's anxious," Morales replied. "She senses that something's gone wrong, but she has no idea how much you've uncovered. Stay where you are. We'll take it from here." The next morning, Morales followed up with another call. "We carried out the search warrant today," she said. "We found communications between Helen and her accomplice, Paul, that confirm your account. There's also evidence of tampering with your father's financial estate. Both Helen and Paul are now in custody." A breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding escaped me. "So it's really over?" I asked. "It's over," she confirmed. "And because of your quick action, you're safe." As I hung up, I collapsed onto Lila's couch. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight of fear started to lift. Helen and Paul had tried to destroy me, but they hadn't counted on my strength. Finally, I felt free. The day after their arrest, I sat in Lila's living room, scrolling through a flood of news reports covering the incident. Words like poison plot and inheritance scheme jumped off the screen, stark reminders of how dangerously close I had come to losing everything: my health, my inheritance, even my life. "Check this out," Lila said, holding up her phone. On her screen was a local news clip showing Helen being led into the police station, her face a strange mix of rage and resignation. "It doesn't even feel real," I admitted, setting my own phone down. I lived with her. I trusted her. Even when things felt off, I still gave her the benefit of the doubt. "She shattered that trust in the worst possible way," Lila said, her voice steady. "But you didn't let her win. You stood up for yourself, Julia." I wanted to believe that, but part of me still carried the burden of everything I had lost, not just my father, but the illusion of family Helen had carefully built. The woman my dad had cherished had never truly existed. Later that day, another call came in from Detective Morales. "Julia, I thought you should know," she began. "Paul has confessed. He admitted to orchestrating everything, from the poison to the forged financial records. Helen was deeply involved, but Paul was the mastermind." "Do you think she'll try to blame him completely?" I asked. "That's a real possibility," Morales replied. "But we've gathered substantial evidence. Both of them will be held accountable. You'll need to testify in court, but with what we have, it's unlikely either of them will escape justice." I thanked her and ended the call, feeling a strange blend of relief and weariness. In the weeks that followed, I slowly began piecing my life back together. It was far from simple. Returning to my father's home felt like stepping into a battlefield, where every room carried echoes of Helen's manipulation. To reclaim the space, I hired a professional cleaning crew to help erase the physical reminders of her presence. The house gradually began to feel like my own again, a space where I could exist without the constant pressure of fear. I met with my lawyer during that time to wrap up the remaining legal matters tied to the estate. Helen and Paul had tried to drain funds from my father's accounts, but their attempt had been careless and left an obvious trail. My lawyer reassured me that everything was being put back in order, and, most importantly, my inheritance was safe. As the days turned into weeks, thoughts of Helen and Paul began to fade from my mind. I found myself thinking more about what lay ahead. For such a long time, my energy had been consumed by simply staying ahead of their manipulations. Now, I was finally free to focus on a new chapter, my own future. The day I testified in court against Helen and Paul, I entered the courtroom with a sense of quiet strength. It wasn't simple to see them again, Helen with that cold, unforgiving stare, and Paul wearing his usual smug expression, but I was determined not to be shaken. Guided by the prosecutor, I shared everything. I spoke of the suspicious emails, the security footage, and even the contaminated food. With each sentence, I felt myself regaining strength, a sense of control they had tried to steal from me. Helen never looked directly at me, while Paul smirked through much of my account, acting as if the situation didn't concern him. But once the prosecutor began detailing the evidence piece by piece, even his smug facade began to show cracks. When the proceedings ended, I stepped outside into the brisk afternoon air and felt a remarkable lightness, as if the burden of their betrayal had finally lifted. Detective Morales met me with a subtle but warm smile. "You did well, Julia. They'll be held responsible for what they've done." I gave her a nod, taking a moment to let her words truly sink in. Justice, I realized, wasn't only about consequences. It was about closure, about knowing I had done everything possible to protect myself and honor my father's memory. As I walked away from the courthouse, a new resolve filled me. I would never again allow myself to be manipulated or used. Several weeks after the trial, I found myself in my father's study. The sunlight spilled across the wooden floor, illuminating the space. A comforting blend of old paper and cedar filled the room, faint but familiar. On the desk sat a photograph of us from my graduation. I picked it up, gently tracing the edge of the frame with my fingertips. "I did it, Dad," I whispered. "They're gone. They can't hurt us anymore." The house felt transformed, lighter, filled with safety and calm. It no longer stood as just a building made of stone and wood. It was a sanctuary. It belonged to me. And for the first time in a long while, I truly felt at peace. Wanting to keep my father's spirit alive, I made the decision to use the house for a greater cause. I contacted nearby charities and offered to host intimate events and fundraising gatherings in his name. He had always emphasized the value of giving back, and this felt like a fitting tribute to everything he stood for. One evening, while standing on the back porch watching the sunset, Lila joined me, carrying 2 glasses of wine. "To new beginnings," she said, lifting her glass with a smile. "To freedom," I answered, gently clinking my glass against hers. As the sky melted into a blend of soft oranges and warm pinks, a powerful realization settled over me. Helen and Paul had done their best to break my spirit, but instead, they ended up revealing my strength. What lay ahead was mine to shape, and I was ready to make every moment count.